the night that changed the world. At exactly 1:23 in the morning, the impossible happened. A blast tore through the roof of a nuclear reactor with such force that it launched a 2,000-ton concrete lid into the air. Within seconds, a pillar of glowing blue light pierced the darkness above northern Ukraine. The people watching had no idea they were witnessing the worst nuclear disaster in human history. Children stood on apartment balconies, fascinated by the strange colors dancing in the sky. Couples stopped to admire what looked like a beautiful fire in the distance. Firefighters rushed toward the flames without protective suits, believing they were responding to an ordinary industrial accident. None of them knew that every second they stayed there, invisible radiation was passing through their bodies, destroying cells that could never be repaired. But here's the question that still haunts historians nearly 40 years later. How could one of the world's most advanced nuclear power stations explode during what was supposed to be a routine safety test? Was it human error, a fatal design flaw? Or was it a disaster that had been waiting to happen for years? The answers are far more disturbing than most people realize. Because Chernobyl wasn't simply an accident, it was the result of fear, secrecy, overconfidence, and a chain of decisions that turned one quiet spring night into a catastrophe the world would never forget. And by the end of this story, you'll understand why the true horror of Chernobyl didn't begin with the explosion. It began long before anyone pressed the first button. History. Introduction. If you visit the city of Pripyat today, you'll find empty apartment buildings slowly being reclaimed by nature. Rusted Ferris wheels stand frozen in time. School classrooms remain exactly as they were left, with notebooks still scattered across dusty desks. Trees grow through broken concrete, while silence fills streets that were once alive with laughter. It's difficult to believe that nearly 50,000 people once called this place home. Pripyat wasn't built by accident. It represented the pride of the Soviet Union, a modern city designed for the engineers, scientists, and families who operated one of the largest nuclear power plants on Earth. Everything about the city symbolized progress. Everything looked perfect. But beneath that confidence, hidden problems were quietly growing. Tonight, we'll uncover what really happened during those final hours before reactor number 4 exploded. We'll separate fact from myth, reveal mistakes that remained hidden for years, and discover why this disaster reshaped the future of nuclear power forever. Because once we step into April 1986, there's no turning back. Chapter 1. A city built for the future. To understand Chernobyl, we first have to understand the world that created it. The year was 1986. The Cold War divided the planet into two competing superpowers. Every achievement mattered, not just in science, but in politics. Every successful project became proof that one system was stronger than the other. The Soviet Union wanted to demonstrate its technological power. Nuclear energy became one of its greatest symbols. Unlike coal or oil, nuclear power promised enormous amounts of electricity from relatively small amounts of fuel. It represented the future, and nowhere reflected that ambition more than the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. Despite its famous name, the plant wasn't actually located inside the town of Chernobyl. Instead, it stood about 10 miles away, near a brand new city built specifically for its workers. That city was called Pripyat. Construction began in 1970. Within just a few years, Pripyat became one of the most modern cities in the Soviet Union. Young engineers moved there with their families. Doctors, teachers, construction workers, and scientists all believed they were helping build a brighter future. Life seemed comfortable. There were modern apartment blocks, schools, hospitals, sports centers, movie theaters, cafes, parks filled with children. The average age of residents was only around 26 years old. It wasn't just a city, it was a dream. People believed they were living in the future. Every morning, buses carried workers to the massive nuclear complex, where 4 powerful reactors generated electricity for millions of people across the Soviet Union. From a distance, the station looked almost peaceful. Towering cooling structures, long concrete buildings, white steam rising gently into the sky. Everything appeared carefully controlled. Safe, reliable. Few questioned what happened behind those walls. Because questioning authority wasn't encouraged. The Soviet system valued confidence. Admitting weakness often meant admitting failure. And failure was something officials desperately tried to avoid. That culture would soon prove deadly. But before disaster struck, one reactor, known simply as Unit 4, was preparing for a routine experiment that had already been delayed several times. no one realized history was quietly moving toward midnight. Chapter 2. Inside Reactor Number 4. To most people, nuclear reactors are mysterious machines. Massive, complicated, almost impossible to understand. But at their core, they're surprisingly simple. Atoms split apart, releasing enormous amounts of heat. That heat boils water into steam. The steam spins giant turbines. The turbines generate electricity. Under normal conditions, it's an incredibly efficient process, but only if every safety system works exactly as designed. Reactor number 4 used a design known as the RBMK reactor. It was powerful, affordable, easy to build on a large scale, but it also had weaknesses. Weaknesses that many engineers knew about, yet few openly discussed. Unlike many Western reactor designs, the RBMK had characteristics that could make it unstable under certain operating conditions. Operators were trained to avoid those situations. The assumption was simple: if everyone followed procedures, nothing could go wrong. On paper, that sounded reassuring. Reality would tell a different story. On April 25, 1986, engineers began preparing for a scheduled safety test. Ironically, the test itself was meant to improve safety. The goal was to answer one important question: if the plant suddenly lost external power, could the spinning turbines continue producing enough electricity for a few extra seconds until emergency diesel generators started? Those few seconds mattered. Without electricity, cooling systems could fail. The experiment had been attempted before. This time, officials hoped it would finally succeed. Everything seemed routine. Checklists were completed. Equipment was inspected. Control room operators monitored hundreds of gauges and switches. Outside, Pripyat carried on as normal. Children played in parks. Families watched television. Restaurants served dinner. Nobody imagined that just a few miles away, a series of seemingly ordinary decisions was beginning to create the perfect conditions for disaster. And then, something unexpected happened. The power company requested that reactor number 4 continue supplying electricity longer than planned. The safety test had to wait. Hours passed. The reactor remained running in conditions it wasn't originally prepared for. The night shift eventually took over. A different team of operators entered the control room. Many of them hadn't expected to conduct the experiment at all. Fatigue was setting in. Pressure was building. Schedules had already been disrupted. Still, no one believed they were facing danger. After all, it was only a routine test, or so they thought. What happened over the next few hours would become one of the most studied and most chilling sequences of human decisions in modern history. Because shortly after midnight, the reactor began behaving in ways almost nobody inside the control room truly understood. The test that became a catastrophe. Chapter 3. The Countdown to Disaster. The control room was quiet. Rows of glowing panels stretched across the walls, covered in hundreds of switches, buttons, and flashing indicator lights. Operators watched the instruments with practiced eyes. Most of them had performed similar procedures countless times before. Outside, it was already the early hours of April 26, 1986. Pripyat slept peacefully. No one realized that just a few miles away, history was about to change forever. The delayed safety test was finally allowed to begin. On paper, the procedure looked straightforward. The reactor's power would be lowered, several systems would be monitored, and engineers would record the results before returning everything to normal. But almost immediately, something unexpected happened. The reactor's power didn't simply decrease. It collapsed. Instead of stabilizing at the planned level, the reactor dropped to almost zero power, a condition that made the RBMK reactor extremely unstable. Inside the control room, confusion spread. Operators weren't expecting this. If the test was canceled now, the delay would have been for nothing. Schedules had already been disrupted for hours, and supervisors wanted the experiment completed. So they made a decision. Instead of shutting the reactor down completely, they tried to raise its power again. At first, it seemed possible, but recovering the reactor required overriding normal operating limits. Control rods, the devices designed to slow the nuclear reaction, were withdrawn farther than safety rules allowed. Automatic protection systems were disabled to prevent them from interrupting the experiment. One safeguard after another was removed. Each decision appeared small. Each choice seemed temporary. No single action guaranteed disaster. But together, they were creating the perfect storm. However, this was only the beginning. Chapter 4. A Reactor on the Edge. To understand what happened next, imagine trying to balance a heavy truck on the edge of a cliff. As long as nothing changes, it might stay there. But one unexpected movement, one small push, and everything collapses. That was the condition of reactor number 4. The reactor was now operating at dangerously low power, where the RBMK design became increasingly unstable. An invisible process called xenon poisoning complicated the situation even further. As the reactor slowed down, a gas called xenon-135 built up inside the core. This gas absorbed neutrons, making it harder for the nuclear reaction to continue. The more the operators tried to increase power, the more xenon fought against them. It was like pressing the gas pedal while someone else kept pulling the car backward. To compensate, even more control rods were pulled from the reactor. By this point, the reactor was operating far outside recommended safety limits. Many experts later concluded that it should have been shut down immediately. But the operators believed they still had control. They had no reason to think the reactor itself could betray them. Unknown to them, the RBMK reactor had a dangerous design flaw. At low power, small changes could produce unexpectedly large increases in energy. And the reactor gave very little warning before becoming unstable. Nobody in that room could fully see what was happening inside the core. They relied on instruments, calculations, experience, but the reactor was hiding something. Deep inside the fuel channel, steam bubbles were beginning to form. Normally, that wouldn't sound alarming. In most nuclear reactors, steam reduces the nuclear reaction, but the RBMK behaved differently. Incredibly, more steam actually made the reaction stronger. The hotter the reactor became, the more power it produced, and the more power it produced, the hotter it became. It was a vicious cycle, a chain reaction feeding itself. The countdown had already begun. The operators simply couldn't hear it. Separation. Chapter 5. The final experiment. At 1:23 a.m., the safety test officially started. Steam to the turbines was reduced. The massive generators slowly began losing speed. Exactly as planned. For a brief moment, everything appeared normal. The turbines continued spinning. Electrical output decreased gradually. Data flowed onto recording equipment. The experiment seemed to be working. But hidden beneath the reactor's steel and concrete shell, conditions were changing faster than anyone realized. Water flow through the core decreased. Steam bubbles multiplied rapidly. Power levels started rising, then rising even faster. Warning alarms echoed across the control room. Lights flashed. Operators exchanged nervous glances. Something was wrong. Very wrong. Then came the decision that has been debated for decades. Seeing the reactor becoming unstable, the senior operator ordered an emergency shutdown. He pressed the AZ5 button. It was supposed to save the reactor. Instead, it destroyed it. But how could the emergency shutdown button cause a nuclear disaster? The answer remained hidden inside the reactor's design. The control rods inserted by the AZ5 system were tipped with graphite. As they first entered the reactor, those graphite tips briefly increased the nuclear reaction before reducing it. Under normal conditions, this effect lasted only a fraction of a second. It wasn't dangerous, but these weren't normal conditions. The reactor was already critically unstable. That brief increase became catastrophic. Within seconds, power surged beyond anything the instruments could measure. Some estimates suggest the reactor's output jumped to more than 100 times its intended operating level. Fuel channels burst apart. Water instantly turned into steam. Pressure built faster than the reactor could contain it. Then everything exploded. Chapter 6. The moment the world changed. At 1 hour 23 minutes and 40 seconds a.m., a violent explosion ripped through reactor number 4. The blast lifted a concrete and steel lid weighing roughly 2,000 tons, tearing the reactor apart. A second explosion followed moments later. The roof collapsed. Walls shattered. Chunks of burning graphite rained across the plant. For the first time in history, the core of a commercial nuclear reactor lay completely exposed to the open air. Workers staggered through clouds of dust and debris. Many couldn't even understand what they were seeing. Some insisted it couldn't possibly be the reactor. It must be a hydrogen tank. It has to be the turbine hall. Because according to everything they believed, a reactor simply could not explode. They were wrong. Pieces of radioactive graphite glowed on the ground like burning charcoal. Firefighters arriving at the scene picked them up with their bare hands, unaware that they were holding some of the most radioactive material ever released by a nuclear accident. Above the destroyed reactor, an eerie blue glow illuminated the night sky. It looked almost beautiful, but it wasn't. That strange light came from ionized air and intense radiation escaping freely into the atmosphere. Invisible particles began drifting across Europe. The disaster had already spread beyond the power plant, and almost no one knew it. Inside Pripyat, people slept peacefully. Parents tucked children into bed. Young couples watched late-night television. Night shift workers prepared for another ordinary day. None of them had been warned. None of them knew that an invisible enemy was already moving through the city. However, the explosion itself was only the first chapter of the tragedy, because the people who rushed in to save the plant had no idea they were walking straight into a level of radiation few humans had ever experienced. And many of them would pay with their lives. The Invisible Enemy Chapter 7, The First Men into Hell. The first emergency call reached the local fire station only moments after the explosion. The message sounded almost routine. A fire had broken out at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. Nothing more. No one mentioned radiation. No one warned the firefighters what they were about to face. Within minutes, red fire engines raced through the quiet streets toward reactor number 4. The men inside joked with one another, believing they would be home before sunrise. It was just another fire, or so they thought. As they approached the reactor, the scene became stranger. Chunks of black material were scattered across the ground, glowing faintly in the darkness. The roof of the reactor building had been ripped apart. Flames danced between twisted steel beams, and above it all, an eerie blue light shimmered into the sky. The firefighters had never seen anything like it. Still, they did what firefighters always do. They ran toward the danger. Among them was Lieutenant Vladimir Pravik, only 23 years old. His team immediately climbed onto the burning roofs surrounding the destroyed reactor. Their mission was simple: stop the fires before they spread to the other reactors. If those reactors also became involved, the consequences could be unimaginable. The men carried heavy hoses across roofs covered with radioactive debris. Some unknowingly stepped on pieces of graphite from the reactor core itself. Others picked them up with bare hands, thinking they were ordinary chunks of concrete. Within minutes, many began noticing something was terribly wrong. One firefighter later described a strange metallic taste in his mouth. Another felt intense heat, not from the flames, but from inside his own body. Their skin turned bright red, almost as if they had been badly sunburned. Some started vomiting before the fires were even under control. They couldn't understand why. The radiation was invisible. It had no smell, no warning, no sound. Yet it was already destroying their bodies. But what happened next shocked everyone. Despite overwhelming evidence that something extraordinary had occurred, many officials still refused to believe the reactor itself had exploded. That single mistake would cost thousands more people their health. 1766. 10 cross thousands more people their health. Inside the power plant, confusion quickly turned into disbelief. Plant managers struggled to understand the reports coming in from workers. Some claimed the reactor was completely destroyed. Others insisted that was impossible. One senior official repeatedly argued that an RBMK reactor simply could not explode. It violated everything he believed about nuclear engineering. Instead of accepting the worst-case scenario, many leaders convinced themselves that the instruments had failed. They believed the reactor was still mostly intact. That assumption delayed critical decisions. Even worse, radiation monitors at the plant created a false sense of security. Most of the available devices could only measure relatively low levels of radiation. When they reached their maximum reading, they simply stopped climbing. Operators looked at the numbers and assumed the radiation wasn't especially dangerous. But the truth was horrifying. The instruments weren't showing the real levels because they literally couldn't. One engineer eventually found a high-range dosimeter stored elsewhere in the facility. When he used it near reactor number 4, the reading was almost beyond comprehension. The radiation was thousands of times higher than normal. By then, many workers had already received deadly doses. Still, the public remained unaware. Just 3 kilometers away, nearly 50,000 people slept peacefully in Pripyat. Children would soon wake up, eat breakfast, and head outside. Parents would open windows to enjoy the warm spring air. No warnings came. No evacuation orders were issued. Life continued almost normally. And with every passing hour, radioactive particles settled onto streets, rooftops, playgrounds, and gardens. The invisible enemy was everywhere, yet almost no one knew it existed. However, the disaster was no longer confined to Ukraine. The radioactive cloud was already beginning a journey that would alarm the entire world. Section 17. The secret the world discovered first. As dawn broke over northern Ukraine, smoke continued pouring from the destroyed reactor. The graphite core burned intensely, carrying radioactive particles thousands of feet into the atmosphere. Wind became the disaster's greatest ally. Hour after hour, the radioactive plume drifted across borders. Belarus was hit first, then Poland, then Scandinavia. But Soviet leaders still had not publicly admitted what had happened. Inside the Soviet Union, information was tightly controlled. Officials feared panic, they feared embarrassment, and perhaps most of all, they feared admitting failure. For nearly 2 days, ordinary citizens continued living as if nothing unusual had happened. Children played soccer, families held picnics, people attended weddings and birthday celebrations. Many unknowingly inhaled radioactive dust with every breath. Then, something unexpected happened hundreds of miles away. At the Forsmark nuclear power plant in Sweden, workers arrived for their normal shifts. As they entered the facility, radiation alarms suddenly began sounding. At first, managers feared there had been a leak inside their own plant. Operations were halted immediately. Workers were carefully inspected. But the contamination wasn't coming from Sweden. It was stuck to their shoes and clothing, picked up from outside. Scientists quickly realized something astonishing. The radioactive material had traveled through the atmosphere from another country. Satellite data, weather patterns, air samples, everything pointed toward the Soviet Union. Now the world was asking a terrifying question. If Sweden could detect radiation, what exactly had happened at Chernobyl? The Soviet government could no longer keep the truth hidden. Within hours, international pressure mounted. The disaster that officials hoped to contain had become impossible to deny. But even after admitting an accident had occurred, one heartbreaking decision still remained. A decision involving an entire city that had no idea its future had already been stolen. Because while governments argued over information, the people of Pripyat were still waiting, still trusting, still believing everything was under control. They had no idea that within hours they would leave their homes forever. The city that never woke up again. Chapter 10: The Evacuation of Pripyat. Morning arrived with clear skies. To the people of Pripyat, April 26th seemed almost perfect. Children laughed in playgrounds. Families walked through parks. Fishermen stood along the Pripyat River. Couples planned their weekend. From certain parts of the city, residents could even see smoke rising from the power plant. Some climbed onto balconies to watch the strange glow above reactor number 4, believing it was simply a dramatic industrial fire. Many later recalled that the air tasted metallic. Others complained of headaches. Some children began vomiting. No one connected these symptoms to radiation. How could they? No one had warned them. As the hours passed, doctors at the local hospital noticed something deeply troubling. Plant workers and firefighters were arriving with burns that didn't look like normal burns. Some had no visible injuries at all, yet they were becoming violently ill. Their skin darkened, their bodies weakened, their condition deteriorated with terrifying speed. Medical staff did everything they could, but they had never treated radiation exposure on this scale. Meanwhile, government officials debated what to do. Evacuating an entire city would be an admission that something catastrophic had happened. For precious hours, the discussion continued, and every minute mattered. By the afternoon of April 27th, more than 36 hours after the explosion, the decision was finally made. Pripyat would be evacuated. More than 1,000 buses began arriving from across the region, the streets filled with engines, soldiers, and police officers directing traffic. Residents gathered outside, confused but surprisingly calm. Then, loudspeakers echoed through the city with an announcement that sounded almost reassuring. They were told they would be leaving only temporarily, just a few days, long enough for officials to deal with the situation. People were instructed to bring identification, essential documents, and a small amount of clothing. Everything else could stay. They would return soon. So they locked their apartment doors, left family photographs on the walls, set dinner tables for meals that would never be eaten. Children left favorite toys on their beds. Pets waited by windows expecting their owners to come home. But those owners never returned. Nearly 50,000 people left Pripyat believing they would be back within days. Instead, their city became one of the most famous ghost towns in history. However, while buses carried families away from danger, thousands of others were being sent directly toward it. Chapter 11: The Liquidators. With reactor number 4 still burning, Soviet leaders faced an impossible challenge. How do you stop a nuclear reactor that no longer exists? The answer came in the form of ordinary people: soldiers, engineers, coal miners, pilots, construction workers, firefighters, scientists. Together, they became known as the liquidators. Over the following years, hundreds of thousands of men and women would take part in the cleanup effort. Many volunteered. Others were ordered to go. Almost all understood that the mission was dangerous. Very few understood just how dangerous. One of the first tasks involved helicopters. Pilots flew directly over the open reactor, dropping thousands of tons of sand, boron, lead, clay, and other materials in an attempt to smother the burning core. Every flight exposed crews to intense radiation. Some missions lasted only seconds over the reactor. Even those few seconds carried enormous risk. Then came another terrifying problem. The roof surrounding the destroyed reactor was covered with highly radioactive debris. Pieces of graphite continued emitting deadly radiation. Robots were sent in to clear the material. Most failed. The radiation destroyed their electronics almost immediately. Machines built for war couldn't survive, so the Soviet Union turned to human beings. Young soldiers climbed onto the rooftops wearing heavy protective gear. Each man was allowed only about 90 seconds on the roof. 90 seconds. That was all. They sprinted across the surface, grabbed chunks of radioactive debris with shovels, threw them over the edge, and ran back. Then, the next soldier repeated the process, again and again. Because of their incredibly short exposure time, they became known as biorobots, not because they were machines, but because they were being asked to do what machines could not. Many later suffered serious health problems. Some lost their lives. Others carried invisible scars for decades. Yet without their actions, the disaster could have become even worse. But another crisis was unfolding beneath the reactor itself, and it threatened an explosion far more powerful than the first. Chapter 12. The mission beneath the reactor itself. And it threatened an explosion far more powerful than the first. Chapter 12. The mission beneath the reactor itself. Deep beneath reactor number 4, thousands of tons of molten nuclear fuel continued burning through concrete. Scientists feared a nightmare scenario. Below the reactor sat large pools of water. If the molten fuel reached them, it could trigger a massive steam explosion. Some experts believe the blast might destroy the remaining reactors and release even more radioactive material across Europe. Whether later estimates of the explosion's potential were overstated remains debated by experts. But at the time, the fear was real. And leaders believed immediate action was essential. There was only one way to reduce the risk. Someone had to enter the flooded lower levels of the plant. In complete darkness. Surrounded by radioactive water. 3 volunteers stepped forward. Engineer Alexei Yanonenko, Engineer Valery Bespalov, and Shift Supervisor Boris Baranov. Their mission sounded almost impossible. Find the valves, open them, drain the water, then somehow make it back alive. Flashlights barely pierced the darkness. Water reached their knees as they searched through flooded corridors. Every minute increased their exposure. The entire Soviet Union waited. Finally, they found the valves. With tremendous effort, they turned them. Water began draining away. The immediate danger of a massive steam explosion was greatly reduced. For years, stories claimed the 3 men died almost immediately from radiation exposure. But later historical research showed a more complex truth. Baranov died years later from heart-related illness, while Yanonenko and Bespalov lived for decades after the disaster. Their mission remained one of the bravest acts of the entire Chernobyl response. Even after the fires were extinguished and the water drained, the crisis was far from over. The destroyed reactor still had to be buried beneath an enormous concrete structure known as the sarcophagus. The radiation would remain, not for years, not for decades, but for generations. And as scientists began measuring the true scale of the contamination, the world realized something chilling. Chernobyl wasn't just a Soviet disaster anymore. It had become humanity's warning.